It started in a factory in Indianapolis. A young man gets pulled into a belt-driven machine. His arm is crushed, his head is injured. After that, something changes. Within a year, he's stealing guns. Within 3 years, he's leading bank robberies across Indiana. Inside prison, other men look to him for direction. One of those men is John Dillinger. In 1933, Harry Pete Pierpont walks out of the Indiana State Prison at Michigan City in one of the most daring escapes in state history. Weeks later, he storms a jail in Ohio and a sheriff ends up dead. By the time it's over, the country knows the name Dillinger. But behind that legend was a man who never sought the spotlight. This is the life of Harry Pierpont. It began in Muncie, Indiana. Harry Pete Pierpont was born on October 13, 1902, to Joseph Gilbert Pierpont and Lena Orcutt Pierpont. He was the middle child. His older sister Fern, born September 21, 1900, would later die of tuberculosis while Harry was still a teenager. His younger brother Fred was born July 5, 1906. The family had modest roots. His father was originally from Kentucky, a woodworker by trade. His mother was from Jay County, Indiana, of German ancestry. By 1910, the Pierpont family was living at 1145 McLean Street in Indianapolis. Joseph Pierpont worked at a carriage factory. City directories from 1911 and 1912 show the family at 1234 Lee Avenue. They were not drifting. They were working people, moving where employment required, building a life in a city that was growing on industry and manufacturing. Harry attended Assumption School in Indianapolis and graduated from the 8th grade. Records describe him as intelligent, above average in ability. He did well in school. Nothing in those early years suggested a career in armed robbery. By the time of the 1920 census, the family was living at 2113 Morris Street in Indianapolis. Harry, 18 years old, was working as a bench worker in an automobile plant. Indianapolis at the time was tied to the booming auto industry. It was steady work, hard work, the kind that built strong backs and long days. Then came the summer of 1921. At the factory, Pierpont was caught in a belt-driven machine. His left arm was crushed. It never fully recovered. During the same incident, he suffered a head injury. After that, according to accounts from his family, something changed. He complained of headaches, dizziness, and problems with his eyesight. He struggled with sleeplessness. He became sullen, suspicious, prone to sudden outbursts. His mother later told authorities that her son's personality shifted after the accident. On September 19, 1921, an inquest was held. 2 days later, Harry Pierpont was committed to the Central Indiana Hospital for the Mentally Ill. Doctors diagnosed him with dementia praecox of the hebephrenic type, a term used at the time for a form of schizophrenia. It was a serious diagnosis, especially in the early 20th century when psychiatric treatment was limited and stigma was heavy. That same year, 1921, Pierpont was arrested in Indianapolis for carrying a concealed weapon. He was held for 10 days before the charge was dismissed. It was a small incident on paper, but it marked the first official entry of his name into police records. He was 19 years old. The injury at the factory had left physical damage. The commitment to the state hospital placed him under psychiatric supervision, and the arrest for carrying a weapon hinted at something darker taking shape. The records do not offer a simple explanation. They show a young man with intelligence, a working-class background, a serious industrial accident, and a diagnosis that followed him into adulthood. By the end of 1921, Harry Pierpont had already crossed into a different life, one documented not in school records or factory logs, but in police reports and hospital files. And this was only the beginning. By the start of 1922, Harry Pierpont was 19 years old and already drifting away from the life his family had tried to build in Indianapolis. On January 2, 1922, he stole an automobile in Indianapolis and drove it west to Greencastle, Indiana. There, he walked into the Cook hardware store and robbed it. He took 9 handguns. It was not a spontaneous theft. It was deliberate. He armed himself. 5 days later, on January 7, 1922, Pierpont tried to steal another car back in Indianapolis. This time, the owners, Mr. and Mrs. Devine, caught him in the act. A struggle followed. During the confrontation, Pierpont fired a shot, slightly wounding Mr. Devine. Mrs. Devine fought back. According to reports, she struck Pierpont over the head with a roast she had been holding. It was a chaotic, almost surreal scene, but the consequences were serious. Pierpont was arrested. While being held in jail in Terre Haute, he attempted to escape. Authorities later discovered that he had soared through the bars of his cell. Even at that early stage, confinement did not quiet him. It sharpened him. On March 12, 1922, Pierpont was sentenced to serve 2 to 14 years at the Indiana State Reformatory for assault and battery with intent to murder. He entered the institution as a young man barely out of his teens, now officially marked as a violent offender. On November 17, 1923, he was transferred to the newly built reformatory at Pendleton, Indiana. The move did not signal improvement. Prison officials described him as volatile. At one point, the superintendent reportedly characterized him as wild as a March hare. He resisted authority. He tested limits. On May 1, 1923, Indiana Governor Warren T. McRae denied Pierpont's request for clemency. The state was not prepared to shorten his sentence. But his mother, Lena Pierpont, did not give up. She visited prison officials regularly and pressed the argument that her son was mentally ill. She pointed to his 1921 head injury and his commitment to the state hospital. She insisted that he was not a hardened criminal but a damaged young man. Her persistence made a difference. On March 6, 1924, the parole board granted Harry Pierpont parole. After serving roughly 2 years of his sentence, he was released. His family had moved to Brazil, Indiana, where his father operated a sand and gravel business for a time. Pierpont went there after his release and returned to civilian life. But the pattern had already formed. He resumed contact with known criminals. Authorities later suspected him in additional thefts, including a possible robbery of the Sour Wine Theatre in Brazil. The first imprisonment had not reformed him. It had introduced him to other offenders, exposed him to prison culture, and given him a reputation. By 1924, Harry Pierpont was no longer an injured factory worker trying to find his footing. He was a parolee with experience in violence, weapons, and confinement. And the next phase would be bigger. By late 1924, Harry Pierpont was living in Kokomo, Indiana, in a boarding house run by Pearl Mullendore, better known as Pearl Elliott. Elliott was a local madam with a reputation, and her house had become a meeting place for men who had already done time. Many of them had crossed paths at the Indiana State Reformatory. Prison had not scattered them, it had introduced them. By November, authorities would identify Pierpont as the leader of a 7-member gang. Newspaper accounts at the time described him as the ringleader, and the others would later confirm it. The first major strike came on November 26, 1924. At 2:45 in the afternoon, 7 men led by Pierpont walked into the South Marion State Bank at 31st and Washington Streets in Marion, Indiana. 5 entered the bank. 2 remained outside. The leader went in first and ordered, "Hands up." The cashier and bookkeeper were forced into the vault. The robbery was carried out with precision. No shots were fired. Approximately $4,000 in cash was taken. The men fled in a Nash motor car with yellow license plates. Reports of their direction conflicted. 16 towns within a 50-mile radius were alerted. Sheriff Burt Renbarger of Grant County pursued leads, stopping vehicles that matched the description. The gang vanished. Authorities suspected the same group had robbed the Farmers National Bank in Converse the week before, though that connection was based on description and method rather than direct proof. 3 weeks later, on December 16, 1924, the gang struck again. Just before closing time, 6 armed men stormed the Citizens State Bank in Noblesville, Indiana. They rushed inside, brandishing revolvers. 3 moved to the rear to control bank officials. 3 covered customers and the cashier. Bank President Dunn managed to press a burglar alarm button with a revolver at his head. The alarm triggered an immediate retreat. The gang fled empty-handed in a Cadillac bearing Indiana license plate 11829. It was a failed job, but it showed their willingness to move fast and in daylight. 6 days later, on December 22nd, 1924, the gang robbed the John D. Shelby hardware store in Lebanon, Indiana. They stole rifles, shotguns, revolvers, pocket knives, ammunition, flashlights, and batteries. The car used that night was a Moon sedan with license plate 443554, stolen from Indianapolis. They were arming themselves again. On December 23, 1924, at 3:45 in the afternoon, 6 armed bandits entered the Upland State Bank in Upland, Indiana. Within 15 minutes of closing time, they looted approximately $2,500 in cash, both paper and silver. They attempted to lock employees in the vault. When the safe malfunctioned, they scooped up the money in sight. One bandit warned officials that any false move would result in having the hell shot out of them. The group fled north and then reportedly turned west. Deputy Sheriffs John Schell and Woody Smith had encountered 6 suspicious men earlier that day at a filling station in Marion. The men were asking for directions to Hartford City and State Road 35. They were driving the same Moon car with plate 443-554, previously noticed for traffic violations. Days later, the car was found abandoned in mud near Kempton, Indiana. The men had hired a garage mechanic to pull it free, carrying rifles and shotguns. They told him they were hunters from Louisville, Kentucky, heading home for Christmas. The unraveling began on December 27, 1924. James Robbins, 22, of Lebanon, Indiana, was arrested after flashing a large amount of cash. He confessed to participating in the Upland robbery, the Noblesville attempt, and the Lebanon hardware store theft. His confession led to the arrest of William Behrens, 20, of Monticello, Indiana, on December the 29th. Behrens initially denied involvement but changed his story after witnesses identified him. Both men denied involvement in the South Marion robbery. On December the 30th, 1924, Marion Red Smith, 22, of Springfield, Illinois, was arrested in Indianapolis. He admitted participating in the Upland robbery but denied involvement in Marion and Noblesville. Robbins and Behrens were arraigned in Grant County Circuit Court and pleaded guilty, receiving sentences of 10 to 20 years at the Indiana State Reformatory. Smith pleaded guilty and received 10 to 25 years for automobile banditry. On December 31, 1924, Mary Bridgewater, 29, was arrested in Indianapolis as an accomplice in the South Marion robbery. She admitted being in the Nash car outside the bank but denied receiving any of the stolen money. On January 2, 1925, Robert Morse, 25, and his wife Emily Morse, 27, were arrested. Both admitted involvement in the South Marion robbery. Robert claimed he received only $153 instead of the promised $600. Emily acknowledged she knew the men intended to rob the bank. On January 10, 1925, George R. Fraser, 23, of Kokomo, was turned in by his father. Fraser pleaded guilty to auto banditry and received 10 to 25 years. He stated that Mary Bridgewater and Emily Morse had known about the robbery plans and that Bridgewater had scouted the South Marion Bank by cashing a check before the holdup. One by one, the gang members fell. Most were arrested and sentenced before Pierpont himself was captured. By early 1925, what newspapers described as one of the largest robber roundups in Indiana had taken shape. The confessions were detailed. The prison connections were clear. The leadership pointed in one direction. Harry Pierpont remained free for the moment. But the circle was closing. By March 1925, Indiana law enforcement understood they were dealing with an organized crew. The earlier arrests had weakened the group, but the robberies did not stop. The methods were consistent. Daylight entries, quick control of employees, planned escape routes, stolen cars switched along the way. The pattern carried Pierpont's signature. On March 10, 1925, shortly before 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 4 unmasked men entered the New Harmony Bank and Trust in New Harmony, Indiana. They locked employees and customers inside the safe. The haul totaled $10,000, $6,000 in cash, and $4,000 in bonds. When bank treasurer Frank Steelman failed to open the vault quickly enough, he was struck with the butt of a pistol and suffered a severe scalp injury. Assistant cashier Mrs. Schultz opened the safe and fainted during the ordeal. The men escaped in a gray Hudson sedan toward Evansville, last seen near Wadesville. A farmer near Griffin later reported being stopped and questioned by armed men who demanded to know where they could obtain a boat to cross the Wabash River. By the next day, sightings placed the gang in Gibson County near King, Indiana. Peace officers across the Midwest were alerted. Orders circulated to take no chances. 12 days later, on March 22, 1925, Earl, Northern, and Everett Bridgewater were detained in Kokomo on suspicion of possessing a stolen car. The vehicle was later determined to be legitimately held, and they were released. The car would later be identified as one used in a getaway from a Kokomo bank robbery. That same night, Pierpont, using the alias Mason, visited local attorney C.T. Brown after midnight, asking him to represent two friends detained at the police station. He refused to give their names, but handed over a $100 gold certificate as a retainer. By morning, the suspects had been released. It was a small but telling glimpse into how the gang operated, with false names and quiet legal maneuvering. On March 27, 1925, at 1:30 in the afternoon, 5 armed bandits entered the Southside State Bank in Kokomo. The robbery lasted 15 minutes. 3 men forced employees into a back room while another guarded them. Cashier A.E. Gorton was held at gunpoint and forced to open the vault. When he struggled with the combination, he was threatened with being shot. The gang left with $4,828.40 in cash and $4,300 in Liberty bonds. A local resident, Vernon Shaw, walked in during the robbery and was relieved of $18. A small terrier named Speedy attacked one of the bandits and was kicked into the basement. The escape showed planning. The robbers fled in a Blue Moon touring car that had been stolen the night before in Fort Wayne, bearing license plates stolen from a Chrysler in Indianapolis. Witnesses saw them switch vehicles outside town, abandoning the Moon car, which was later found riddled with bullet holes 6 miles east of Kokomo. 4 days later, on March 31, 1925, 2 unmasked men robbed the Laketon State Bank in Laketon, Indiana. The robbery occurred around 9 o'clock in the morning. Between $1,000 and $1,800 in cash was taken, though several $1,000s in bonds were overlooked. The men fled first in a Ford touring car stolen in Milford, then transferred to a Willys Night vehicle bearing stolen license plates traced back to Fort Wayne. Sheriff Summerland of Wabash County coordinated with Grant County authorities. Reports placed suspicious vehicles in LaGrange County and Warsaw. Road alerts were issued. Descriptions circulated statewide. The cashier, E.L. Bright, and assistant cashier, Mrs. Violet Ogden, later failed to positively identify Pierpont after his arrest. Even so, the similarities in timing, execution, and vehicle theft tied the Laketon robbery to the broader string of crimes. By early April 1925, sheriffs across Indiana were communicating regularly. Grant County, Howard County, Boone County, and others were sharing vehicle descriptions, license plate numbers, and suspect names. The Indiana Bankers Association had taken a particular interest in the case. Pinkerton operatives were involved. What had begun as isolated robberies was now treated as coordinated, habitual criminal activity. The net was tightening. Within days, that tightening would reach Detroit. By April 1925, the investigation that had stretched across Indiana finally reached beyond state lines. On April 2, 1925, Detroit police arrested Harry Pierpont at an apartment he shared with Thaddeus Ted Skier and Skier's girlfriend, Louise Brunner. When officers entered the residence, they found revolvers and guns hidden under pillows, inside closets, and in bureau drawers. Reports varied slightly on the totals, but authorities recovered large sums of cash. One account stated Pierpont had $850 in new $150 bills on his person. Other reports indicated that as much as $4,000 in cash was seized from him, along with securities totaling approximately $5,400 found inside the apartment. Brunner was reported to have diamond rings and other jewelry. At the time of arrest, Pierpont gave his name as Frank Mason. Later that same day, he admitted his true identity. Authorities alleged he had led the robberies of the South Marion State Bank, the Upland State Bank, and the Southside State Bank in Kokomo. The Indiana Bankers Association had already been tracking him, and investigators in Fort Wayne suspected Skier's involvement after tracing the theft of an automobile used in the Kokomo robbery. On April 3, 1925, another suspect, James Roscoe Whitey Hayes, was arrested in Detroit but later released. Meanwhile, Pierpont and Skier waived extradition. Warrants charging petit larceny and bank robbery were issued in Kokomo by City Judge Joseph Kripe. Howard County Prosecutor Homer Miller announced plans to pursue habitual criminal charges, which carried the possibility of life imprisonment. Pierpont and Skier were transported back to Indiana under heavy guard. They traveled by train from Detroit to Peru, Indiana, and then by automobile to Kokomo, where they were lodged in the Howard County Jail. Even in custody, Pierpont was already thinking ahead. While awaiting trial, authorities discovered an escape attempt underway inside the jail. Pinkerton operative F.C. Huntington uncovered 10 saw blades hidden in the prisoners' cells. One bar in Skier's cell had been completely severed. A bar in Pierpont's cell had been partially cut through. 4 saw blades had already been used. Pierpont had reportedly boasted after his arrest that he would never stand trial. The discovery of the saw blades suggested he intended to keep that promise. His younger brother, Fred Pierpont, was arrested on suspicion of aiding the escape attempt. He was later acquitted. The trial moved forward in the Howard County Circuit Court. On April 5, 1925, Pierpont and Skier appeared before City Judge Joe Kripe. Prosecutor Homer Miller coordinated with defense attorneys Overman and Healy, along with Carl Bree, who had been retained by Pierpont's parents. Bond was set at $10,000 each. Public concern grew over whether the aging jail could safely hold experienced criminals. Then, on May 6, 1925, in a surprise move, Pierpont took the stand. He admitted to entering and holding up the Southside State Bank in Kokomo. He described fleeing to Fort Wayne afterward, where the stolen money was divided among himself and 3 others. He attempted to shift primary blame to Skier, portraying him as the planner of the robbery. The admission did not spare him. The jury convicted Harry Pierpont. He was sentenced to serve 10 to 21 years in the Indiana State Reformatory and fined $1,000. That same day, he was returned to the Indiana Reformatory at Pendleton for the second time. He entered the prison system again, not as a young offender testing his limits, but as a convicted bank robber identified as a gang leader. The state had secured its conviction, but inside prison walls, Pierpont's influence was only beginning to grow. From the beginning, he challenged authority. He refused to cooperate with prison officials. He gave the wrong name when processed. He declined to recognize the warden. He refused to make a formal statement and resisted having his photograph taken. At one point, he spat on a guard. The administration quickly understood they were not dealing with a compliant inmate. At Pendleton, Pierpont first crossed paths with 2 younger prisoners, John Dillinger and Homer Van Meter. Dillinger had been sentenced to 10 to 20 years for an attempted robbery in Mooresville, Indiana. Pierpont was only 8 months older than Dillinger, but he carried himself like a veteran. Inside the institution, experience mattered more than age. Other inmates respected him for his defiance and his ability to endure punishment. Within 2 months of his return, prison officials had enough. After an attempted escape in which Pierpont tried to drill through the bars of his cell, he was transferred on July 30, 1925, to the Indiana State Prison at Michigan City. The move was intended to isolate him and restore order. Instead, it placed him in a setting where his influence expanded. At Michigan City, Pierpont became one of the most respected inmates among the prison population. He gathered around him a group of seasoned offenders, including Charles Mackley, Russell Booby Clark, and John Red Hamilton. When Dillinger was transferred there in July 1929, he joined the circle. Homer Van Meter would later follow. The prison system, meant to contain criminal networks, had become a training ground. Pierpont was known for his ability to withstand hunger and physical punishment. Solitary confinement did not break him. It reinforced his standing among other inmates. He emerged as the informal leader of an elite clique of bank robbers. Within that group, discussions moved beyond past crimes and toward future ones. It was inside Michigan City that Dillinger learned the mechanics of professional bank robbery. Pierpont and Mackley discussed bank layouts, timing, crowd control, and escape routes. They studied the discipline methods developed by the German-born robber Hermann Lamb, whose systematic approach to casing banks and organizing getaways had influenced Midwestern criminals. The conversations were practical, not theoretical. They focused on preparation, division of roles, and speed. Pierpont also never stopped looking for a way out. On December 29, 1930, he participated in a prison escape attempt led by Joseph Burns. Burns had fashioned a key from a spoon, allowing inmates in Cell House D to free themselves from their cells. 12 men were involved, including Pierpont, Albert Roseberg, James Jenkins, Dick Day, Howard Ware, Morris Delature, Frank Badgley, Louis West, Wayne Williams, Willard Tex, and Russell Clark. They overpowered guard Guy Burklow and barricaded the doors to prevent intervention. Burklow managed to sound the alarm. City police, firemen, and prison guards responded quickly. The inmates were forced to surrender. The attempt failed, but it reinforced Pierpont's image inside the walls. He was relentless. Every confinement was temporary in his mind. By the early 1930s, the groundwork had been laid. A disciplined group of inmates, connected by loyalty and shared experience, had formed under Pierpont's influence. Dillinger, younger and ambitious, absorbed the lessons. The plan that would eventually shake Indiana's prison system was already taking shape in whispered conversations behind steel bars. The state believed it had locked away a gang leader. Inside Michigan City, that leader was building something larger. By the summer of 1932, Harry Pierpont had spent 7 years inside the Indiana State Prison at Michigan City. He had failed before. He had tested the bars, studied the guards, and endured solitary confinement. This time, he planned something larger. The idea was not an impulsive dash for the yard. It was structured, calculated. Pierpont began organizing a core group that included Charles Mackley, Russell Clark, and John "Red" Hamilton. These were not random inmates. They were experienced bank robbers serving long sentences. They understood discipline. They understood silence. The escape would require help from outside, money for weapons, contacts, a safe place to land. There was one man positioned perfectly to help: John Dillinger. Dillinger had been transferred into Pierpont's circle years earlier and had absorbed the lessons discussed inside Cell House D. On May 10, 1933, Dillinger was paroled from Michigan City. Out on the streets, he made gestures toward reform, but those did not last. He began robbing grocery stores and banks across Indiana and Ohio. The purpose was direct. He needed cash to fund the breakout. The plan was clear. Dillinger would raise money on the outside, he would secure weapons. He would get them inside the prison. Once Pierpont and the others escaped, Dillinger would join them as a full partner in a coordinated robbery crew. By late summer 1933, Dillinger had obtained 3.45 caliber pistols. How the weapons entered Michigan City has never been definitively established. Some accounts suggest he threw them over the prison wall, similar to an earlier attempt. The more widely accepted theory is that the guns were hidden inside boxes of thread shipped to the prison shirt factory, where inmates worked. What is certain is that 3 loaded revolvers made their way inside. On August 24, 1933, Pierpont appeared before the Indiana State Clemency Commission. He requested release from prison, arguing that he was a man of strong character, a leader rather than a follower. Briefs submitted on his behalf noted that when he had been sentenced in 1925, he openly stated he would attempt escape and that preventing it was the state's responsibility. His prison record included 2 previous convictions, 10 punishments, 2 reprimands, and 1 merit braid. In 1931, he had declared he would become a model prisoner, and supporters claimed he had improved his behavior since then. The commission denied his request. 2 weeks later, on September 13, 1933, 3 loaded revolvers wrapped in Chicago newspapers were discovered near the west wall of the prison by 2 inmates. Authorities believed prisoners Danny McGeogen, Jack Gray, and Eddie Murphy were connected to the smuggling effort. They were placed in solitary confinement. The weapons were intended for Pierpont and his conspirators. The discovery did not stop the plan. It only narrowed the window. By late September 1933, Pierpont, Mackley, Hamilton, and Clark were ready. The groundwork had been laid for more than a year. Dillinger had done his part on the outside, weapons were inside the walls. The next move would not be quiet. It would become one of the most significant prison breaks in Indiana history. On September 25, 1933, during an exercise period inside the Indiana State Prison at Michigan City, Harry Pierpont and his closest conspirators made their final decision. They would move the next day. Each man swore an oath that he would not be taken alive without a fight. The morning of September 26, 1933, began like any other inside the prison shirt factory. Shortly after 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the plan was set in motion. Pierpont, Charles Mackley, John Red Hamilton, Russell Clark, Walter Dietrich, James Oklahoma Jack Clark, Edward Schaus, Joseph Fox, Joe Burns, and Jim Jenkins were armed with 3.45 caliber pistols smuggled into the prison by John Dillinger before his parole. The weapons were concealed until the moment they were needed. Pierpont and Russell Clark approached shirt factory superintendent George H. Stevens and told him an official needed to see him in the basement. When Stevens entered the lower level, he walked into an ambush. He was overpowered. Walter Dietrich then lured Deputy Superintendent Albert E. Evans into the same trap by claiming a fight had broken out. Evans stepped into a room where 7 men were waiting with pistols and 3 more with clubs. He was seized immediately. Foreman Dudley Triplett entered soon after and was also captured. Pierpont had a personal history with Evans. During his years inside, Evans had administered harsh punishment. According to accounts, Pierpont was prepared to kill him. Dietrich intervened, arguing that gunfire would alert the entire prison. Control mattered more than revenge. With Stevens leading the way under threat of death, the group began moving carefully through the prison corridors. Guns were concealed beneath stacks of shirts they carried to avoid suspicion. Guards and inmates watched but did not immediately grasp what was happening. It was a slow, deliberate procession through steel gates. At the first gate, Stevens ordered guard Frank Swanson to open it. Swanson complied after being told the prisoners were armed and would kill if necessary. He was then taken prisoner as well. At the third steel gate, the men used a steel shaft as a battering ram. Guard Fred Wellnitz was beaten. Guard Guy Burklow, who had once foiled an earlier escape attempt, was forced to open the outer gate. Inside the administration building, the violence escalated. 8 civilian clerks were herded into vaults. During the chaos, 72-year-old Finley Carson was shot in the leg and shoulder by Joe Burns after failing to move quickly enough. Warden Lewis E. Kunkel encountered the group and was quickly taken hostage. By then, the alarm had sounded. Outside the gate, heavy rain was falling. The escapees split into 2 groups. One group consisted of Dietrich, James Clark, Fox, and Burns. The other group included Pierpont, Hamilton, Russell Clark, Mackley, Schaus, and Jenkins. The Dietrich group encountered Sheriff Charles Neal, who had just delivered prisoners to the facility. They overpowered him, took his weapons, and forced him to drive 3 of them away. They later abandoned Neal's vehicle near Wheeler, Indiana, after seizing another car. Pierpont's group struck a gas station outside the prison. Attendant Joe Porleski was struck over the head. They commandeered a vehicle, releasing 2 female passengers but forcing the driver to continue. A few miles west, they hid temporarily in a farmhouse around 2:30 p.m. By midnight, Pierpont was knocking on the door of Mary Kinder in Indianapolis. Kinder, his girlfriend, immediately asked about her brother Earl Northern, who had been intended to join the escape but was in the infirmary during the breakout. She had already arranged refuge at the home of her reluctant boyfriend, Ralph Seffel. The fugitives needed civilian clothes. Kinder and Seffel went downtown to purchase them. Pearl Elliott soon arrived at the Seffel home with money. The escaped prisoners now had clothing, cash, and temporary shelter. The gang then shifted toward Ohio. Harry Copeland, a Michigan City parolee and associate of Dillinger, had secured a house at 1054 South 2nd Street in Hamilton, Ohio. The group abandoned one stolen car in Indianapolis and took another. Indiana State Police Captain Matt Leach set up a blockade after learning of the theft. During a high-speed attempt to evade police, the car door flew open and James Jenkins fell out. The others did not stop. Jenkins was later killed that evening by a local posse near Bean Blossom, Indiana. Within 24 hours, the prison break had turned lethal beyond the prison walls. The fugitives regrouped between Indianapolis and Hamilton, Ohio. Some stayed temporarily at a farm owned by Pierpont's parents near Leipzig, Ohio. The operation had succeeded. 10 men had walked out of one of Indiana's most secure prisons. They were armed. They were organized. And within days, they would turn their attention to freeing the man who had made the escape possible. By early October 1933, Harry Pierpont and the escaped Michigan City prisoners were laying low in Hamilton, Ohio. The address was 1054 South 2nd Street, secured through Harry Copeland. It was supposed to be a temporary refuge while they regrouped and began planning robberies of their own. Then the news reached them. John Dillinger had been arrested in Bluffton, Ohio, and was being held in the Allen County Jail in Lima. The man who had financed their escape, who had raised the money and smuggled in the guns, was now behind bars. For Pierpont, that changed everything. The decision was made quickly. They would break Dillinger out. On October 12, 1933, Columbus Day, the group drove to Lima, Ohio. The approach was calculated. Pierpont and Russell Clark visited a local attorney, asking about arranging a visit for Dillinger's sister. The lawyer told them he would speak with the sheriff the next day. That delay convinced the gang they could not wait. At approximately 6:25 p.m., Pierpont, Charles Mackley, and Russell Clark entered the Allen County Jail. Waiting outside were John "Red" Hamilton, Edward Schaus, and Harry Copeland, acting as lookouts. Inside, the three men confronted Sheriff Jess Saber. They claimed to be officials from the Indiana State Prison, there to return Dillinger to Indiana custody. Saber asked to see their credentials. Pierpont responded by firing 2 shots. One struck Sheriff Saber in the abdomen. Saber was not immediately incapacitated. According to reports, Mackley and Pierpont beat him, demanding the keys to Dillinger's cell. Saber refused to surrender them. His wife, present inside the jail, retrieved the keys from a drawer in an attempt to stop the assault. With the keys secured, the gang unlocked Dillinger's cell and freed him. They locked Mrs. Saber and Deputy Wilbur Sharp inside a cell before fleeing the building. Sheriff Jess Saber died approximately 90 minutes later from his wounds. The rescue was successful. Dillinger was back on the street, reunited with Pierpont and the others. The jailbreak in Lima marked a turning point. The Michigan City escape had embarrassed Indiana authorities. The killing of Sheriff Saber during a jail assault escalated the stakes. Law enforcement across Ohio and Indiana now viewed the group as armed fugitives responsible for the death of a county sheriff. Within days, newspapers would begin referring to them as the Dillinger Gang. Pierpont did not object to the name. What mattered was that the crew was whole again. And with Dillinger free, the robberies would soon begin. With John Dillinger freed from the Allen County Jail on October 12, 1933, the group was no longer operating as scattered fugitives. They were organized again, armed and flush with purpose. Law enforcement now believed Harry Pierpont was the strategist behind the operations, but the press increasingly attached Dillinger's name to the crew. The label stuck. The gang's first moves were not banks. On October 14, 1933, Dillinger, Pierpont, and Walter Dietrich raided the police station in Auburn, Indiana. They were not looking for cash. They wanted weapons and bulletproof vests. A week later, around 10 p.m. on October 20th, Dillinger, Pierpont, and Dietrich struck again, this time at the police station in Peru, Indiana. The goal was the same: more guns, more protection. Authorities began to believe the gang had declared open war on law enforcement. The Indiana National Guard was placed at the disposal of state police. Volunteer posses formed. Meanwhile, the gang was living quietly in Chicago apartments. Their first major bank job after reuniting came on October 23, 1933 at 2:45 p.m. The target was the Central National Bank in Greencastle, Indiana. It was homecoming weekend at DePaul University and the town was busy. The plan had been sketched out by Pierpont. Escape routes had been studied. A large Studebaker was parked on a hill beside the bank. 4 men entered: Dillinger, Pierpont, Charles Mackley, and either Harry Copeland or Russell Clark. Pierpont initially approached a teller window to change a $20 bill. When redirected to another window, he produced a Thompson submachine gun. The others drew their weapons. The robbery moved with speed and discipline. Within 5 minutes, they were gone with approximately $74,000 in cash and bonds. Not a single shot was fired. The police station sat across the street, unaware of what had happened until the gang was already gone. By mid-November, the heat in Indiana intensified. The gang based themselves at 4310 Clarendon Avenue in Chicago. Pierpont, Dillinger, Mary Kinder, and Billy Frechette shared a flat. Despite the manhunt, they moved through the city with relative freedom. On November the 20th, 1933, they drove north to Racine, Wisconsin. Earlier that week, Mary Kinder had helped case the American Bank and Trust Company by entering and changing a bill while the men observed the layout and planned escape routes. Internal tensions were rising. Harry Copeland's drinking and Ed Schaus's conduct had created friction. Schaus was dismissed from the gang shortly before the robbery. At 2:30 p.m., Pierpont entered the Racine Bank carrying a Red Cross poster. He pasted it over the front window to block visibility from the street. Mackley, Dillinger, and John Hamilton followed. Mackley shouted orders to the tellers. When teller Harold Graham did not comply quickly, Mackley shot him in the elbow. As Graham fell, he triggered the alarm. Police responded rapidly. Pierpont covered the lobby, ordering customers to the floor. Dillinger forced the bank president and staff to open the vault. 2 officers arrived during the robbery. Pierpont surprised one of them, while Mackley shot and wounded the other. The gang took hostages, including the bank president and several women, and used them as shields while exiting. Mackley fired at responding detectives as they fled. Traffic slowed their escape. At one point, an officer riding on the running board was thrown off the car. Once clear of town, the gang drove into a wooded area, loosely bound their hostages, and instructed them to remain for 20 minutes before leaving. The robbery had escalated from precision to gunfire. The violence drew national headlines. With pressure mounting, the gang retreated south. They rented a beach house in Daytona Beach, Florida. It was an attempt to disappear. The house became a temporary refuge where they swam, fished, and tried to live like ordinary vacationers. On New Year's Eve, Dillinger fired a Thompson submachine gun into the air at midnight. It was reckless. It was loud. It reflected the confidence they felt after months of evasion. The break did not last. On January 15, 1934, Dillinger and John Hamilton entered the First National Bank in East Chicago, Indiana. Pierpont remained in the getaway car. The robbery moved quickly, but police had anticipated trouble. Officers took positions outside the bank. As Dillinger exited, Officer William P. O'Malley fired at him. Dillinger was wearing a bulletproof vest and was unharmed. He returned fire, killing O'Malley. Other officers opened fire as Dillinger and Hamilton ran toward the car. Hamilton was struck and wounded during the exchange. The gang escaped, but the consequences were immediate. The killing of Officer O'Malley intensified the manhunt across multiple states. What had begun as bank robbery had become the pursuit of men accused of murdering both a sheriff and a police officer. The days of operating openly in Chicago apartments and Florida beach houses were coming to an end. By late January 1934, the Dillinger Gang believed distance would buy them safety. After the East Chicago robbery and the killing of Officer William P. O'Malley, the pressure across Indiana and Ohio had become relentless. The group headed west, eventually settling in Tucson, Arizona. They rented rooms under assumed names. They paid cash. They tried to blend in. But Tucson was not Chicago. It was still a town where strangers stood out. On January 22, 1934, a fire broke out at the Hotel Congress, where some of the gang members were staying. Firefighters responding to the blaze recognized the men from newspaper photographs that had circulated nationwide. Law enforcement was alerted. Within days, officers began making arrests. On January 25, 1934, Harry Pierpont, John Dillinger, Charles Mackley, and Russell Clark were taken into custody in Tucson. They were arrested one by one, without the kind of gun battle many had expected. Their women were also detained. The fugitives who had humiliated prison officials and raided police stations were now photographed in a local jail cell in Arizona. Extradition followed quickly. Dillinger was sent back to Indiana to face charges connected to the murder of Officer O'Malley in East Chicago. Pierpont, Mackley, and Clark were returned to Ohio to stand trial for the murder of Sheriff Jess Saba in Lima. The Saba killing carried the possibility of capital punishment. The trial took place in Allen County, Ohio, in early March 1934. A key witness for the prosecution was Ed Schaus, a former member of the gang who had been dismissed before the Racine robbery. Schaus provided testimony about the group's structure and actions. His statements helped establish the roles played during the Lima jailbreak. The prosecution argued that Pierpont had fired the shots that struck Sheriff Saba on October 12, 1933. Testimony detailed how Pierpont and Mackley beat Saba when he refused to hand over the keys and how Mrs. Saba ultimately surrendered them in an effort to stop the assault. Medical evidence confirmed that Saba died approximately 90 minutes after being shot. The defense faced steep odds. The jailbreak had been brazen. The sheriff's death was undisputed. Public sentiment was unforgiving. In early March 1934, the verdict was delivered. Harry Pierpont and Charles Mackley were convicted of the murder of Sheriff Jess Saba and sentenced to death in the electric chair. Russell Clark was also convicted but received a life sentence instead. The decision meant Pierpont would not return to Michigan City. He was transferred to the Ohio Penitentiary in Columbus to await execution. Outside the courtroom, there was speculation that Dillinger might attempt another rescue. After all, he had once helped engineer a prison break from the inside and had already stormed one jail to free a partner. When Dillinger later escaped from the jail in Crown Point, Indiana, on March 3, 1934, using a wooden gun, authorities tightened security around Pierpont and Mackley. Extra precautions were taken at the Ohio Penitentiary in anticipation of a possible assault. No rescue came. By the spring of 1934, Harry Pierpont, once the dominant figure inside Michigan City, now sat on death row in Columbus, Ohio. The gang that had moved across state lines with discipline and confidence was fractured. The final chapter was approaching. By September 1934, Harry Pierpont had been on death row at the Ohio Penitentiary in Columbus for months. His appeals were exhausted. Charles Mackley occupied a nearby cell. Russell Clark, serving life, remained behind bars. John Dillinger had been shot and killed by federal agents outside Chicago's Biograph Theater on July 22, 1934. Any hope of rescue from the outside was gone. That left only one option. On September 22, 1934, exactly 2 months after Dillinger's death, Pierpont and Mackley attempted to duplicate the Crown Point jailbreak that had stunned the country earlier that year. They carved imitation pistols out of bars of soap and darkened them with shoe polish to resemble real weapons. Armed with these fake guns, they forced their way out of their cells inside the death house. For a brief moment, it appeared the plan might work. They moved toward the main door of the execution block. Guards, however, were alert and heavily armed. When the two condemned men reached the doorway, rifle fire erupted. Charles Mackley was struck and killed during the gunfire. Pierpont was hit multiple times. He survived, but he was seriously wounded. The attempt ended within seconds. Pierpont was returned to his cell to recover from injuries that would never fully heal. His execution date remained in place. In the early morning hours of October 17, 1934, Harry Pete Pierpont was carried into the execution chamber at the Ohio Penitentiary. He was too weak from his gunshot wounds to walk unassisted. Witnesses recorded the time carefully. At 12:09 a.m., the current was applied. At 12:14 a.m., he was pronounced dead. His death certificate listed his age as 32 years and 4 days. It recorded his birth on October 13, 1902 in Muncie, Indiana. His occupation was noted as former engineer. His marital status was listed as married. His mother, Lena Pierpont of RR2, Lakeville, Indiana, served as the informant. Harry Pierpont was buried in Holy Cross and St. Joseph Cemetery in Indianapolis. He had entered the Indiana prison system as a young man convicted of assault. Inside, he became a leader among bank robbers and a mentor to John Dillinger. He helped plan one of the most significant prison breaks in Indiana history. He walked into a county jail and shot a sheriff. He died in the electric chair at 32. The records show intelligence, discipline, and resolve. They also show violence, loyalty to his crew, and a refusal to submit to confinement. His story sits in the shadow of Dillinger's legend, but inside the prison walls, Pierpont was the one others followed. And in the end, there was no escape.